Welcome to Unlike-Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology.
Pothead by Katie Rose Rogers. For LS, my dearest friend across the sea, you are shinier than he. When I say the universe brought him to me, I'm saying if I can't have him in this life, I will find him in the next. Even if I'm a slug and he's a butterfly, if I'm a cat and he's a crocodile, I would let him eat me just to live in his belly. This is what Louise told herself after sobbing in the shower for 48 minutes. Her ass had become numb to the porcelain as she was partaking in the most tragic ritual of all, the sad girl shower. Too forlorn to stand, she sat on the ground, hair knotting under the falling water, blots of red dye seeping down her back. Her roommate could hear her through the walls, but was beyond all pretenses of empathy. They had spent many nights, including this one, drunk and sprawled on the floor, discussing in detail the highs and lows of Louise and Theo's 6-month affair. The highs included the first night when he bit her lip and almost growled in want of her, or the time he lent her his house in Joshua Tree so she could focus on her book away from the thin walls of her apartment and the angry calls of the city. The lows included that he needed to choke her to come, that he did not join her in his desert house but merely offered her the keys and address. He had a gig in Echo Park. He was a drummer. She ended up alone in his part-time home, definitely not writing the follow-up to her debut novel. She had found a bobby pin in the bathroom, a thin strand of hay-coloured hair still in its teeth. Then, fueled by the discovery of a bobby pin, went through the mid-century modern drawers and found a yellow bikini, a pale pubic hair ensnared in the bottoms. Then, in the trash, she found the foil of the corner of a birth control pack. Then a melted chapstick taunted her from the shade of the palm tree by the pool. The flavour? Strawberries. Strawberries gave Louise hives. Another low, Louise called Theo, and through broken sobs and caught breaths, accused him of having others. And Theo responded with, "Of course he did. He wasn't hiding. He had told Louise he could never be monogamous. Doesn't she remember?" Louise remembered, but she felt his want so deep in her chest, in his hand on her throat as they made love that first night, that she thought, I can make his want spread. He will have no room to desire others out of need for me. Geez, Louise, she was wrong. But if he didn't want only her, then why did he say he loved her? Why did he listen to her rant on about the genius of Didion and Babbitts and then send her articles about her female gods? Why did he read the books she gave him? He had returned Slow Days and Fast Company with his notes in the margins. He had thought of her. If he didn't cherish her, then why did he learn to braid her hair when the power went out during those historic rainstorms? Louise didn't understand, and she never would. She grew up on Turner movie classics, specifically Bacall and Bogey. She fell in love just how they kissed, with a deep, quick dip and fierce abandon. She was focused. It's what made her writing good, but made men run. And Theo ran. She sat him down and demanded exclusivity. The lowest of her many lows went like this. He just shook his head and moaned in annoyance. Louise, we talked about this. And so Louise sat in her shower, planning her next 3 lives in pursuit of Theo. An okay man and a medium, if not life-threatening, lay with a receding hairline who played drums in mid-level venues with his once popular band. When I say I've moved on, imagine me like the fattened koi fish at our pond, mouth gaped open, fighting desperately with the birds for crumbs of day-old bread. The next morning, Louise brushed out her long matted hair, dyed red with henna since her junior year of college when she had first read Plath's Lady Lazarus, and her finisher, Out of the Ash. I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. Louise had yet to eat a man like air, but she wanted to. The closest she got was a nibble and hiccups. The revenge of fitting into a vintage 1950s striped dress after a summer of sunning and roller skating in Long Beach. Of taking a photo, hands on her hard-worn hips, feeling so shiny. by posting said photo in said dress with a tiny waist and then receiving a message from a non-digested ex. It's been a while. How are you? Looking good. Louise planned on such revenge for Theo. She would be the most interesting. She would write books. Her editors would have kind and thoughtful notes. Her TV friend would adapt it to much acclaim just as she did her first book. She would eat well, yogurt and oatmeal every morning. She would swim laps twice a week, hike Runyon and not gawk at the B-list celebrities. Today she planned on deepening her research for her main character, a potter named Sarah who witnessed a murder at the studio. She loved Sarah already, but realized she didn't know her outside of what she saw, and decided now was the time to gather, as she liked to call her process. She would be Sarah the potter, and take all she could, starting with her first pottery class that morning. Louise bought all the tools recommended for a beginning potter. A modelling tool, ribbon tool, loop tool, potter's rib, wire clay cutter, which looked like something to garrote someone with. Perhaps this is what the murderer used, Louise scribbled in her notebook. A metal scraper, needle tool, and a sponge. She wore a ragged pair of jeans and an old t-shirt. As she braided her hair, she tried not to think of Theo's hands entangled in the layers. She failed. The pottery studio surprised her. For a place called the Mud House, it was so clean, with precise lines of occupied wheels and a concrete floor that looked as if it had been recently mopped. She glanced around the room at the other students, trying to suss out the teacher, landing on a long-haired man with a patchwork of tattoos. He reached out for her hand to shake. His nails were yellow and his hands were as rough as sandpaper. She pictured his hand on her throat. No, too rough. She pictured his hand in her hair, but his calluses caught on the strands, getting stuck. No, Louise would not fall in love with this man. She took a breath in relief and introduced herself. The instructor howdy-doodied back to her. His name was Alistair. He was more of a sculptor than a thrower, but he was happy to show her and the other students the ropes of the wheel. She looked at the other students and found the cracked faces of older women, all wrinkled and grey. She found just one student in her decade of life. She tried to smile at her, but this one wasn't interested in making new friends. Louise was fine with that. She was gathering, after all. A writer. Real writers don't need friends, especially published ones. She grabbed the bag of clay laid out for her by Alistair, the instructor, and stumbled under its tremendous weight. She cut a lump from it with the wire garrote tool and slapped it into a ball as the others around her did. She slammed it into the center of the wheel, put her foot on the pedal. She leaned her body over the wheel, dropping her hands to either side of the clay lump, desperately trying to cone it up and down as the others did so seamlessly. But the clay was just wet dirt in her hands. The others had cylinders in front of them, and she had an angry puddle of muck. She tried again and again, slamming newly garroted clay to the wheel, failing again and again. Before she knew it, the class was over. She was covered in clay and no closer to knowing Sarah. In fact, if this was Sarah, Louise hated her. Louise was not a potter. As the rest of the class cleaned the wheels and wrapped their little cups and bowls under plastic, she could cry. This is all she had to distract her, and it's horrible. Not the romantic world she imagined for her protagonist. Alistair sat next to her. I don't know why I'm so bad at this, Louise muttered. I'm usually very artistic. Throwing isn't for everyone. Why don't you stay a little longer for my sculpting class? It might help. Take some of the taste of failure out of your mouth. Louise wondered if he was hitting on her. He looked back unabashed. No, he was not. He was merely a nice man. Not everyone was someone to fall in love with, Louise reminded herself. She told Alistair yes, she would stay for the next class. He told her she will need a different clay, something sturdier with more grog, or as he liked to think of it, fire sand. It gave the clay some heft. Louise nodded and went to the little office where they sold clay and other tools. She studied the bags of clay, pressing her index finger into the sides, not sure exactly what she was looking for. Eventually, a stony white was all she wanted, speckled as if it were a freckled back, soft like the skin beneath the earlobe. When she returned, the room was filled again with more women. It's as if the first hour had never happened. A fresh start. And this was different. They did not sit at wheels. Alistair brought them to a long wooden table. He showed some of them his completed sculptures, all of birds, some perched and some in flight, one with a broken neck and a lopsided beak. Louise studied this one as Alistair told the women to sculpt something that mattered to them. It didn't have to be good, but it had to matter. Louise immediately knew what she would sculpt. She started with his feet. Then his legs, long and thin, with a scar above the knee from when he fell off his bike when he was 8. She thought about adding dark hair to the upper thigh and then to his butt. She rolled a small, uncircumcised penis and attached it above the thighs. She flattened a little loose belly, then the neck, a broad face with a balding head. As if in a trance, she added the arms of a drummer. She looked at the clay man and saw him. Theo, naked and made of dark clay, laying on the table in front of her. She may not have been able to make a cup, but she could piece together the man who broke her heart. Her little clay man was proportional and sleeping, with no mouth yet. Alistair spied over her shoulder. Well, look at him. I like his little pecker. It's got personality. Would you like to fire him? Make him official. Louise looked over to the kiln room, where a large gas-powered kiln sits in the centre, firing, glowing orange at its corners. She looked at little Theo and his misshapen cheeks and his 2 long arms and decided, no, I can make him better. She squished little Theo into a ball and tried again. This time she started with his head and receding hairline. This time she would make him perfect. In this session, she focused and moved slower, giving each centimetre on her former lover the care she wished he gave her. Today she finished his head, his mouth set in a frown. She wrapped it in plastic, then went to the bathroom to wash her hands. The faucet sprayed water on her nails and she rubbed, but the yellow tint wouldn't budge. Before she could obsess, her phone buzzed. A text from Theo reads, I must see you. Louise smiled, dried her yellow hands and texted back, my place. When she arrived, Theo was sitting on the steps of her apartment building, his mouth set in a frown. He held a plastic bag with Chinese food. When Louise reached him, he pulled her into a hug. She smelled his neck. He smelled of the earth. He apologized and they made love, his hands on her throat. He came. She did too. Louise went to the bathroom to piss him and the possibility of a UTI out of her. Then she washed her hands, but the yellow of the nail looked brown now. Rusty. She rubbed her fingers into her palm and the brown flaked off like dry clay. No matter how hard she rubbed, the clay never left. It was as if she herself had fingers of clay. She returned to her bed and found Theo sleeping, the face-down sleep of a man with no concern of a knife falling into his back. His legs neared the edge of the bed. There was no room for Louise, so Louise dressed. She opened her laptop and began to write, clay dusting up the keys as she gave her character Sarah shape. Louise wrote all night, happy to have her man in her bed. When the sun rose, so did Theo. He gave her a small kiss on the cheek and said, listen, last night. Louise knew where this went. Last night was not a mistake, Louise finished for him. She caught him looking at her dirty fingertips and hid them in her lap quickly. We made love. We had sex. Good sex, not everything is love. Yes, but some things are. This is. Louise slammed her laptop shut. Her book will have to wait. If you didn't love me, why did you come over? Why did you sleep in my bed? I don't know. I had to. I just knew I had to. Theo turned towards the door. I'm an asshole. I'm sorry. You won't hear from me again. Theo left her. Louise didn't cry. Instead, she studied her odd hands, the hands of a creator. She grabbed her keys and drove to the studio to find her little clay man, or his head at least. Had Louise figured the connection between this clay man and her own, with her fingertips that crinkled of earth? If she had, would she have continued the build? Louise couldn't tell us because she continued to sculpt. The arms, the gripping hands, the flaccid belly. She touched the penis, the balls, bushy pubic hair. In his car, Theo pulled over suddenly. He opened his phone and he called Louise. She answered and he reached into his lap, unbuttoning his jeans. Theo told Louise he needed her. He wanted her. He was sorry. Louise listened to him pleasure himself as she continued to sculpt. Am I the only one? Louise asked as she attached the legs to the little clay man. She felt her own begin to harden. She looked under the table and saw her legs, like her fingers, turn to clay. You're the only one. She should have stopped then, but she continued with Theo's want in her ear. The more she worked, the more Theo craved. The more our Louise turned to dirt. By the end of the call, Louise had thighs and a tummy of stone and a date with Theo at her house. She wrapped up her sculpture, this time bringing it home with her. He was too precious to leave alone, unfinished, unloved. When I say I'm tired, believe that I exist in 3 separate times at once, at our beginning, at our middle, and at our end. My love for you is jet-lagged without destination, without luggage, confused. They didn't even make love that night, they just talked. Theo told Louise how afraid he was of getting old, how he had Botox the other day on his 11s, how much it hurt, how vulnerable he felt when he looked at the audiences and saw the faces of his fans, aging just as he was. Where did his youth go? Theo wondered. Where did the fans go? When Theo asked her what she feared, Louise didn't have an answer. She just laid on his soft belly and sighed as he played with her hair, brushing it out with his fingers until she fell asleep. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" She heard him scream and she opened her eyes. Her shirt had risen and her stone belly shone in the blue hours. "Nothing, it's nothing." Louise tried to cover up, but the damage was done. Theo looked at her as if she was a monster, not understanding that this was for him. Theo rushed out the door, terrified of the gorgon she was becoming, but Louise remained calm. She looked down at what horrified him, admired the smoothness, the crevices that formed just beneath her breasts and crumbled when she bent over. Theo would want to see her again. She knew the path. She turned the clay Theo's head to face hers. What was she missing? What would bring him back? 2 ears would, one barely lower than the other. Her man wasn't symmetrical. She formed 2 ears and squished them into the head. Then she wiped the wrinkles from his brow. Her own face began to stiffen as the rest of her body had. But she was nearly done. Tonight he will harden. Tomorrow she would fire him. Because finally he was perfect. As she stared at her earthen man, she waited for Theo to call. But when he did, her poor neck couldn't turn. It was too stiff. But it didn't hurt. There was a luxury to dirt spread through her limbs. Cool drift trickling through her body as her phone buzzed over and over, shining like a beacon in her dark room. He wanted her. He wanted her. He wanted her. His want and the stone filled her body as a house might carbon dioxide, slowly and lethally until finally Louise was filled to her brim, vitrified and impervious to water. The last to go were her eyes. They roved round the room and landed on the table. She leaned towards him and felt her neck crack and weaken, but still she leaned until the weight of her head fell forward and slammed onto the table, mixing generously with her man. Finally, in pieces, they would be together.
This has been Unlike Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology. Collection 3, Monster Mash. Stories about creatures, chaos, and the supernatural. Pothead was written by Katie Rose Rogers and narrated by Katie McGrath. Unlike Minded is an August year-round production, created, produced, and edited by Robbie Hyne. We'd like to give a special thank you to everyone who has supported this independent podcast production. You can keep up to date and find more info about this podcast and others on Instagram at the handle August Year-Round Prod, or email us at augustyearround@gmail.com. And be sure to subscribe, leave a rating and review, and tune in next week for another episode of Unlike Minded. Thank you for listening.